Welcome everyone back to the channel. Today I have the privilege of doing a podcast with my uncle, Ahmed, who many of you, if you're in the space and you're on Instagram, you'll probably know him and you'll recognize his beautiful face. Before we get started, do you mind just giving us a quick introduction about yourself?
Yeah, the quickest introduction, I guess, is I'm a storyteller. The challenge is the status quo.
Nice. Okay, so today it's going to be more of an interview style. So I have a lot of questions and we can just run through them.
Sounds good.
So we'll start off with, what were some of the sacrifices that came with being a journalist and a public figure on social media?
Some of the sacrifices. Well, I think for me specifically, beyond the obvious ones, there were some that sort of confronted and challenged my career path, because in journalism, ironically, sometimes telling the truth plainly or adding context that might even be obvious, for example, in the case of Palestine, can cause you, I don't know if I would call it sacrifice, but, can cost you something in terms of people's willingness to want to work with you. But when it comes to credibility, I think for me, I don't view them as sacrifices beyond the fact that there's so many people today who are observing things that I've been saying and many people have been saying in the Palestine context. Including today, we just saw Theo Vaughn, the podcaster, kind of plainly speak a truth that many of us have been speaking for decades to JD Vance. And, even when you speak truth, even though it comes with sacrifice, it seems as if the world is catching up to the fact that the things that might have been perceived as a sacrifice, there's only a few red lines in the media that you can't speak about. Especially in the Western context. I think Palestine is one of them. And I've been doing that since the beginning, since before I was on social media, since I was, a more traditional journalist for a very short period of time. And then social media changed everything.
Was there any toll on your health?
Yeah, mostly because social media is such a reactive space and it's a 24-hour news cycle. So someone like me, I struggled sometimes to know when to pull away, when to take a break, and you constantly feel like you're playing catch up. But that's just about learning to set limits and define boundaries. But yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So next question. With all the misinformation that's out there, what strategies do you use to source your news or your information?
My approach is, I think, what many people do today, which is they find either individuals that they trust who are consistent, who are transparent, who are accountable when they make mistakes. And for me, I've been lucky because I've been a journalist for almost 2 decades now. It's like I've developed a lot of what we call primary sources, who are just on the ground in the thick of it with a proven sort of track record. Whether they're perceived as activists on an issue or doctors, nurses, you know what I mean? So I think we're in a time when, and that's been happening for a while, but now it's like very obvious that people don't necessarily trust institutions. They trust individuals or small groups, like you see these collectives, I would call them, but like independent media, like Dropside and in the US context, Citeo, they're starting to pop up everywhere, which they've recognized that people want to follow. And I guess this is something where for me, it's like, ever since I went into journalism, I never thought that it would be of use to me or of benefit to the reader for me to pretend I have a view from nowhere. Like at Columbia, that's what they teach. It's a sort of somewhat antiquated, in my opinion, approach where you overemphasize the importance of something like objectivity, which often serves just as a guise to obfuscate or to distract from truths or facts. And that's why social media, for me, it's been actually it's like a double-edged sword. It's cheesy to say, but it was designed to be one thing, and in reality, it's something else.
are there any news or media outlets that you would suggest regarding like the topic of Palestine?
For sure. Zeteo is consistent. Dropsite, The Intercept, Democracy Now. The reason I say these isn't because of a particular point of view. Some people might see them as liberal, but these are ones who've been consistent and consistently trying to get to as we heard Theo Van say, as we heard JD Vance respond, strangely enough, to Theo Van today, that we got to get to the source of the issue. We want to address the source of the issue of the conflict. The source of the conflict is quite obvious, I think, to a lot of people who want to pay attention. So those publications are framing things in that same vein, like framing it around what is actually influencing actions and behaviors, policies, if you will, on both sides or on each side. Both sides doesn't mean to pretend that real disproportionate realities are not existent. Both sides, as it's used commonly, should be about framing things accurately and contextually. So yeah, Democracy Now! Is a good one.
Nice. Now that you've grown on social media and you have over 1 million followers, how do you balance posting things that you want to post or that you want to talk about versus catering to what you think your audience wants to see or hear?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think on social media, I probably fall into the trap more often than not, more often than any of us would want to admit, where you end up sort of falling into the pattern of, as I said earlier, being reactive. So it's you might share content that is going to do well because it's what the people want, but is it what they need? Is it what is it what they're lacking? So I always try to take a step back and think like, am I adding something? Is there something constructive in what I'm sharing? But then there's the opposite thing. Like at the beginning of the genocide, I viewed my role primarily as a connector, connecting the people I know and trust and follow in Gaza who are, reporting the facts, and then I'm just amplifying them. That's in part because I think it's what the people need and want, but more it's because I know that that's lacking from the mainstream media. So you want to give people something, news at its core is about novelty. So if everyone is choosing to ignore basic facts, I view my role as like trying to amplify or highlight those facts consistently. That said, on Substack, why it's been so nice for me, even if I don't have yet the biggest following compared to social platforms, for example, nowhere near 1 million. It does feel less reactive. It feels more substantial, more constructive, more instructive for an audience. And that was a nice little shift for me to remember, to your point, that, you don't want to find yourself covering things just because the algorithm will reward it, rather than that there's a need genuinely for that.
Yeah. From an outsider's perspective and to someone who's been following you for a while and recently subscribed to your Substack, I think it's cool that, your Instagram maybe serves as the hook. And then for whoever's interested, they can go to your Substack, and then that's where they can get the depth on all the topics that you cover. It's
funny you say that. It's like, I like your framing, but it's also something I think about often in terms of my Substack. I'm a very emotional person. I'm quite sensitive. And I say that because, sometimes we view these things, vulnerability in our society, not just as men, but in any capacity, we view them as sort of a weakness. But for me, my Instagram, like you said, it's like I am more wearing my heart and even sometimes my brain on my sleeve. Like I'm very accessible there. But I also often sometimes think on Substack, like, am I just venting emotionally because, the reality we're living in is so dystopic? Is this being is the motivation behind sitting down and writing this because I want to sort of process my own emotions and then convey that to a wider audience? Or should I maybe restructure? Sometimes I wonder if people just want to get, like, we live in a time when attention is such a commodity. So it's like people might only need to know, even in the Substack, even though it's deeper, just the very basic facts. Because few people have like the attention span or the willingness, the capacity to keep processing information that's so demoralizing, so dehumanizing, not just to the people that are being, that the crimes in Israel's context are being waged on, but it's dehumanizing for all of us to experience that. I mean, it sounds strange to say, I'm not comparing, but I think that's why so many people turn off.
Yeah. How do you maintain objectivity while reporting on emotional topics?
It's a good question. I don't know that I'm objective. And people immediately see that as like a discrediting statement. But for me, I try to be very transparent about why I am covering the thing I'm covering. And I try to be transparent about it with facts that are persuasive, sure, but that are also undeniable, right? And I don't know that I strive to be objective. I do strive to be sort of fair. I think I'm driven more by like, every decision you make when you're telling a story is you're making an assessment of what's important, what's not important. And I think on the issue of Israel and Palestine, so much of the problem for so long is that the really important stuff for both populations is at best, kind of glazed over, neglected, dismissed, and at worst, it's completely manipulated and misrepresented. And so, yeah, for me, it's like, I think to counter that reality as a Palestinian, but I do this with any community that's marginalized, that's misrepresented. It's like you want to double down on the things that matter to those communities. So I do that, I think, without fear of if I'm perceived as objective. It's so liberating as a storyteller as well. Whether, in the context of news and journalism, it's a bit different, but like any storyteller around, like if someone's writing, a comedy routine, you're writing a screenplay, you want to be authentic, you want to be consistent, credible, because you're being transparent about what you're trying to do, the story you're telling. I don't know, who wants to be objective? Like, who wants to sit on a fence?
Yeah, I think even with the rise in AI, I think what's going to make certain journalists stand out is like, do they sound like a robot?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a point of view that is human intrinsically. It's so valuable at a time of automation, as a time of AI, and this sort of like, because I think so much of what's lacking from media and journalism, but also broader, is like our ability to connect to each other's humanity, each other's lived experiences beyond what we think is morally or religiously. Like, it's that, and that's what's, I know I'm not making a lot of sense, but there is a mirroring between society and how we exist socially in the virtual space. And so we have these walled off, gated communities in real life based on socioeconomic status or what have you. And then we also have them even in the mighty global village, the internet, that it was, designed to be, which is you have these sort of echo chambers, the bias, confirmation bias. And that's how so many platforms that we use to understand the world and to watch stories, however serious or however silly, we have this bias effect where we are living in alternate realities virtually as much as we are in the physical world.
Nice. How have the role of journalists changed with the growth of social media and the decline in TV and cable consumption?
I think it's kind of laughable, if we're really honest. I mean, I don't say this to be dismissive, maybe a little bit, because I have some bitter taste in my mouth from my experience in mainstream TV, but the numbers alone, Jad, are crazy. They're so irrelevant. Even their social
Talking about the news.
Yeah, mainstream news channels. No one consumes them beyond I think CNN, MSNBC, the last I checked, was like the average median age actually of the viewers are in their late 70s. And that's only 1 million, like 2 million. These numbers, as you know, if you compare them with YouTube podcasts, I mean, they're dwarfed on a daily and weekly basis. And so I think the democratized nature of not just like social media, the digital realm, and how that's impacted traditional news and journalism, but you look at like the lines being blurred of what is a source of information, what is a habit that is, either replacing or becoming the new way of, getting information about the world around us. It's become so you can become so selective with what you want to bring in, what you want to seek, that people are just bypassing these larger institutions, for better or worse. I mean, I think it's for better, obviously.
Now that, let's say we go more onto the social media side of things and journalists or people start getting their news from there, how do you think these companies like Meta and Google should be putting any restrictions on what people say? And should they be banning people that maybe have like really extreme views or are spreading misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that there's a unit in the Israeli military, for example, that has graduated, I would say, a majority of executives at so many tech companies, whether Meta or Palantir, whether data-driven or social media. And, we're living in a time when the surveillance state is a real thing. And I think the way that social media companies in particular, but big tech, has been, very conveniently, like Facebook historically, saying, oh, we're not a media company, so we're not going to. And then after doing it under this administration, how quickly Facebook and Meta like switched back under Trump. It's like politics shouldn't play a role in these sorts of things. In my mind, there should be not a selective championing or suppressing of certain communities or groups. And yet we're seeing that, more and more, which is, disheartening to say the least. And there's this cover story, again, not to keep bringing it back to Israel, but like, the story that the world is telling itself, which is completely not true. I mean, you're having 300,000 people today in Rome protesting. It's been 2 years of genocide. We're witnessing a slaughterhouse in Gaza, people being slaughtered daily, children being slaughtered daily, hospitals being bombed daily. And yet, if you compare that with how social media companies are allowing certain information, documenting that to spread or not, and how they choose to comply with certain governments, like Israel, 98%, I think, of their government requests, by Facebook at least, are granted, and they take down so much content. There's this revolving door between Israeli military intelligence and tech companies. And that's just like, it's not a secret in Silicon Valley and beyond. And it's worrying.
If you could sit down with anyone, past or present, to do an interview with, who would it be?
Good question. I don't know. Maybe my grandmother, because I didn't get around to doing it while she was alive, in the way that I would have liked to. There's a lot of questions I'd like to ask about her experience, especially early on in Palestine when she was a kid in Jerusalem. So yeah, Teta Mufido, I would, and she's also quite wise. So it'd be good. I never did it though, sadly.
Yeah, I think it's important, especially for the grandparents, to document their stories. I tried doing it with my grandma, but yeah, it is tough.
Yeah, they're not always very, compliant.
Yeah, and it can sometimes get emotional, in the middle of
them. That's why, especially with a story like this.
Yeah,
our collective story.
Yeah. How do you unwind after reporting on heavy stories?
I come to places like this. That's the honest answer. No, I mean, we all have our tricks, I guess. For me, it's about when I'm in nature is the most effective way to unwind. When I'm not around humans, actually. Because I think, especially reporting, whether you're doing primary reporting, like I used to do for many years, and these days less, I'm doing a lot of what I would describe as secondary reporting. It can be just as taxing on the sort of system, the nervous system. especially when there's so much dehumanization involved, and you tend to be an empathetic person. So I disconnect and I go into nature. Water helps me because I have ADHD. And apparently there's like some sort of tactile physiological thing of being surrounded by water. It's a good reset.
Do you find talking about it with others, does that help?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I say I don't want to be around humans, which sounds, but that's like, it's like a self-regulation thing. Nature calms my nervous system. But then, of course, I have friends and family and people who I, a select group who I do trust and who I feel no judgment from. And then it's, you use them as a sounding board to reset.
What's a book, film, or podcast that has deeply influenced how you approach journalism?
A book, film, or podcast? It's weird because you say film, like there's two films that come to my mind, and it's not a direct correlation with like my professional approach to journalism, but I think it does guide the sorts of stories I do find myself telling and the way in which I tell those stories. And those tend to be around social justice or around basic rights, human rights, social rights, even political rights. And I would say A Time to Kill. I don't know if you've seen that film. But
No.
Shawshank Redemption. Oh my God, now this is showing the age gap.
Yeah. I think I've seen that.
Shawshank Redemption, you must have maybe.
I think it sounds very familiar.
Yeah. These are two films I saw at a very young age that like I was perplexed by how much of society was like, supporting an injustice and those kinds of things, trying to deconstruct that is a theme, I think, in a lot of the storytelling I do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, my belly. My fat belly.
Can I keep that in?
Yeah.
Advertisement
We
for
ain't
my
24
bootcamp.
anymore. How old are you? 24?
21.
We ain't 21 anymore.
It's okay. I'm going to make him a boot camp.
Yeah, we're going to do it.
If you weren't a journalist, what would you have been instead?
A dancer. Why is that funny? Should I not be honest? Sorry, I would be...
Stand-up comedian.
What would I be? Oh yeah, that might still happen. I'm losing my mind slowly. So one day, stand-up comedy. I don't know how big the audience will be, but that seems inevitable at this point. Yeah. No, I really think a dancer, because to put it simply, had I felt I had permission at a young age to continue pursuing dance, I think that would have been a much more fulfilling way to express myself creatively, and a much more natural one. But then because I didn't, for whatever reasons, I think I creatively expressed myself with words, with, journalism, storytelling, film. So it's the same. Dancing to me is the exact same as making a film. It's the exact same as composing a song or writing an article. The only difference is the modality of creative expression. Maybe you could argue dancing is not as intellectual, but I don't know if that's necessarily true.
What's stopping you right now from buying a house in Bali, learning to play golf, eating good food, and retiring?
Nothing. Let's do it. When are we going? Well, you can't retire, but you can come. I'll retire, and you can give me the boot camp so that my golden years are great. Honestly, that's a really good question. What is stopping me from... I don't know. Maybe nothing.
Would you say supporting Palestine is a duty?
For me, I feel yeah. And for everyone, I feel yeah. But to in different capacities. For me, it's a duty, not just because I'm Palestinian, more importantly, because I have this privilege, this experience of, understanding and being part of a world that is so pivotal and so instrumental in keeping the Palestinian struggle for liberation out of view, out of mind. And I've spent many years working within that system, so I have a certain duty to continue to do that, maybe from outside the system, from inside the system. It's like a khibra, like an experience. Mm. But also, I think for all of us, it's a duty. When the level of dehumanization is so defiant and, in my mind, diabolical, inhuman, I think we all have a duty to speak up, because if you don't speak up, that's how, especially in a day and age when we have all these tools and all these devices, if you don't speak up, who's going to speak up for you? Because, history teaches us that it's, there's almost no group maybe not no group, but there's many, many different groups who have been systematically dehumanized in history. And with the way technology is going, and who's to say what's happening to Palestinians today won't happen to some other group, or isn't also happening.
Move on to the questions I had related to my brand, FALASTIN, which is what I'm currently wearing right now. So what does the key, or the symbol of the key, represent to you?
Beyond the obvious symbolism of the fact that 800,000, 750,000 people were kicked out of their home in 1948, to me, the symbolism of it is not just a return, but an affirmation of the right to belong somewhere, to belong to a people, to a land, to a place, and to have a right to determine how you want to live. The key to me symbolizes the right to belong, the right to be, to exist.
What role do stories play in the preservation of Palestinian history?
One could argue that stories play the biggest role and the most fundamental role, because it's one thing to have land and resources and people erased, but there's also a simultaneous, very well coordinated attempt to erase our stories and our right to tell our stories, and for our stories to be about what we want our stories to be about. You know what I mean? I think the right to tell your own story on a collective or individual level is so often kind of overlooked, because that's what basic human expression is really about. You know what I mean? It's like you want to express yourself in a certain way. Also, when you see people spending so much time trying to create a counter narrative, this idea, in the Palestinian context, Zionism, clearly says, land for people without a land. I don't know. It's like storytelling is maybe the most fundamental form of resistance for any group of persecuted people.
What advice would you give to young Palestinians like myself who want to support the cause?
Sorry, my ego got caught up in the fact that I'm not young because you asked me that question. But on a more serious note, I don't think that I particularly have anything new to tell the new, younger generation. Seems like don't take the tools that you have at your disposal for granted, just like you shouldn't take the freedoms that you enjoy for granted, because I think sometimes when we grow up in such a globalized world, and especially when you're young, you tend to think that like what you have is guaranteed. You don't necessarily always have the same sort of sense of value for basic freedoms and privileges, and including basic human dignity being respected, safety. Don't take those things for granted as you continue to move towards a world where, you're focusing more on what you have in common with the other than what separates you.
Nice. Okay, that's all I had.
That's all?
Me. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was easy. I hope this is my
Sorry for the dodgy mic setup.
No, it's my mic.